Well, hello again. Welcome back to our little shop. Some time ago I was actually doing a video on a refret on import Jazzmaster, and I mentioned that a customer had called from out of state and asked me if I could do a refret on his 66. Well, I love irony, so here it is. It's made its way in from Nash Vegas, and we have a vintage 66 Jazzmaster. There's been a few things changed on it. The tuner's been changed to Shallers. This inlay I'm a little iffy about. The nuts obviously been changed. I'm about 99% sure it's been refinished. The knobs, of course, aren't correct. We've got a problem here with the roller knobs that's jammed down underneath the pick guard. There's something going on there. He also mentioned that he wanted it shielded, which, with a vintage instrument, I would, question that. But this one's had so much stuff changed on it, and it's a player grade vintage instrument. That's what he's using it for, so that's what we're going with. So I'm probably going to shield it for him too. But it was brought in mainly for the refret and, like I say, the shielding. But this is going to be a sticky one. We have big inlays and binding, which we had on the CBS Fenders. We've also got a few things. Let's see if we can pick it up here. Right here, if you can see it, there's actually some cracking along the fret edge here, where the fret is either lifted, or it may have been refretted at one time, but I don't think so. We'll find that out too. But I'm finding a few things here along the frets that gives the indication they were driven in from the side, which they should have been. But I'm going to be honest with you, I've not done enough refrets with bound Fenders over the years to be sure about that. The way to actually do that would be probably take the binding off and take the frets out on the side. But that gets us into a few more issues where the binding's a little thin. And the binding's actually been painted white up here for some reason. So like I said, there's a lot of pitfalls here that we're going to run into. This is going to be a sticky one. So I'm going to have to do a little bit of investigating here. He also mentioned that he would like to have a slightly larger fret in it. So I do a lot of times use a 90 thousandths wide but 55 thousandths tall fret to refret Fenders with, for guys that want to bend a little easier and get away from the vintage style frets. That gets us into another issue where, again, we have the thin fingerboard. If this was a slab board, it wouldn't be a problem. We've got the thin fingerboard here again, so we've got hidden depth fret slots we've got to be concerned about. We're going to have to measure those. And if we're going to put anything in it other than vintage style frets with a short tang on it, we're going to have to actually cut the tang height down on the fret to keep from going through the fingerboard. So, like we say, I don't get the easy ones. So I'm going to start tearing this down, checking into it. So let the good times roll. Well, that didn't take long to confirm that suspicion. I pulled the neck. Of course, underneath the original Fender neck shim is the original sunburst finish. The first dead giveaway I saw here was the auto body primer underneath the white, plus the white was just way too white for a 66. While we're here, let's talk about this a minute. I've complained before about neck shimming being done wrong. Right here's a prime example of the way Fender used to do these. This is actually a piece of fiber board, like for pickups or eyelet boards in the Fender amps that they used to use for shim back here in the neck. On the Jaguars and Jazzmasters, it was really bad because they had to tilt the neck so much they put a huge shim back here. And when they put it back behind the neck screws here like this, it almost always causes a kick-up problem at the end of the neck. I've talked about that before and some people have argued with me, but hey, I call it as I see it. So when we're looking at this later and I'm jigging this neck up and turning the fingerboard up, I bet you we find a kick up back here. Although, you can see it's been sanded and rounded off here very heavily. So we'll see what we find. Moving on. Well, here we are. We're not even 10 minutes into this, and we've learned a lot. So, one thing, the binding, I'm pretty sure, has had stripper on it sometime or another. It's a little bit misshapen here and there, thin in several spots. And then the shoulders of the neck have been sanded down to meet the binding. So right here where the binding meets, we actually have a roundness that goes flat down to the binding. Then the binding is actually lower than the side of the neck. It really needs to be rebound. But that just gets us into a whole nother thing. That would actually make getting the frets out easier. But rebinding, reshaping the binding, respring the neck, and all that, he doesn't have time for, which is fine for me. I really don't want to do the binding. I have, but I'd like to avoid it if we could. Second thing, the frets are definitely put in from the side. I can get them out from the top, but I gotta be very careful. I don't like doing it. I like to do things my way, but I'm being forced this time not to. I've got a lot of concerns about these up here where the fingerboard's cracked around them. So we're going to have to take a little bit extra time and care getting these frets out. So, okay. Here we go. Something else I found here that I wanted to mention, and since I have a minute while I'm waiting for these frets to soak a little bit, I've actually added a little bit of water to the sides of the frets here to kind of steam it a little bit when I'm heating them up. I'll let it soak in a little bit, kind of soften the wood up there a little bit. That'll help us get these frets out without doing any more damage than necessary. But what I wanted to mention is I found out here also, when I was checking this guitar out before I tore it down, it had very little neck relief, probably about 0.004 of an inch. It turns out that there's very little truss rod tension on it. So this neck is very stiff. So we need to take that into consideration too, so we can get a little bit more relief in this when we're done. Here we are about an hour and a half in. We've managed to get all the frets out. That actually did pretty well, considering I had to take them out from the top. But I was very careful and we got by with that. So I've cleaned the slots out a little bit and got our basic sanding done here to get things cleaned up a little bit. We're ready to find a nut to use and get this on a neck jig. Here we are. We're all jigged up. I've taken the strings and everything back off of it and checked the fingerboard. And what you're seeing here is these big white spots are where the problem areas are. I always add a little bit more chalk because my little white pencil I use when doing the straight lines to mark it off doesn't show up really well here on the camera for you. Plus, when I sand this, I can tell more what's going on. So, anyway, we had a really good dip over here. This is pretty, I'd say probably at least a 1/64 inch or more dip here. Probably more than that. We had a hump here. We've got a hump right through here. And in this area, still a little high up here, which probably going to bring some of this out. But back here, remember earlier I mentioned the kick up thing? Well, here it is. And your neck bolt is right here. So when they shim back here behind over the years, it just bends this back end up here. It compresses a little bit, so it gives you a little hump. So let's say if a guy sticks a pick in here, let's say you put a pick back in here in this area that shapes something like a diamond back here, you may end up with just a raised spot right here. So anyway, just reiterating. So let's start sanding. We got a lot to do here. The real work's starting. We've got our first preliminary sanding going on here, and you can see where things are already starting to shape up. We're using our Mogamba sanding board that I've made here, and it's actually a piece of thick plexiglass that's perfectly straight with a backing stick. Of course, you can't see the whole thing because it's meant to go the full length of the base neck or whatever. With 60 grit sandpaper on the bottom, you can see where it's been working here. You can see the spots that's sanding heavily and the spots that's not. So we're going to mark this off again. Like I say, you can see up here where it's starting to take the kick up out back here. It's kind of hit through here a little bit, and it's taking a good bit off up here. So we're going to mark this out again and hit it again at this, and then start doing our delicate sanding. We are about 3 hours in at this point. The fingerboard has all been leveled up and trued up. I mentioned earlier that the difficulties with this being the bound fingerboard and the large inlays. The problem with the binding is a lot of times around the binding over really hard to do anything with. It had the little nibs at the end of the frets to start with, but that's not going to be able to be put back. So what we're going to do is lay the fret ends out over the binding like we would on a Gibson. With the Fender neck being a little narrower anyway, this will actually give a little bit more play area. The thing about the inlays was when you're sanding a fingerboard like this, these big inlays, your sandpaper will hit the inlay and skid over it and actually sand around the inlay and leave the inlay high. So what you have to do is actually occasionally go back and scrape those down to make sure that everything levels up well without making craters in the fingerboard. Something else we've run into, I don't know if you can see it here or not. Yeah, there's one. Most of the fret slots originally have been sawed through the fingerboard. There's maple showing on almost all these slots, so we don't have to worry about that. It was done before I got my hands on it, so I can go ahead with the refret here and not worry about that. It's a shame that it was been done. The only way to correct that would be to replace the fingerboard, which also means replacing the binding, replacing the inlays, everything else. And if you saw my old 65 Strat video, I'm not fond of making these curved fingerboards. So anyway, we're not going to do that. So we're going to carry on here. We're going to start cutting frets and start fitting frets. We're back in here the next morning. I've got the frets all cut. I've got my fingerboard waxed. I'm ready to start putting frets in. You may hear in the background we've got some storms going on outside. It's going to be a pretty rainy day. I've got some Freddie King on the CD player to keep me motivated through all this. So I'm going to get started putting these frets in, and between the gluings here, we're going to have to do about 4 different gluings, which is going to be probably about 2 hours worth of waiting time while the glue cures, all told. I'm going to go over here and start on the body. Can't wait to see what we find in this. So, here we go. Be back later. Okay, let's take a look under the hood, shall we? Oh, got one more screw. Okay, Well, that's in pretty good shape. Gotta love this. We can clean all that up. Okay, let's see what's going on here. Why? Oh, okay. Looks like the knobs maybe just need to be lined up on the pots here and a few things to get the presets to work. All in all, this doesn't look as bad in here as I thought it would. When we shield this, we're going to put the original brass plates back in this. But we're going to create a different ground bus instead of being grounded to all the plates. We'll also add a ground wire from here up too, so if the jack comes loose, he won't lose his ground. Okay, let's get into it. Well, demo's done. We've got to clean up a little bit of this flaky paint here and there and get things ready to start this shielding job. A couple more hours have gone by here. At this point we have all the frets in, the ends trimmed, beveled and polished, and the frets leveled up. So we're ready for our fret dress. Our fretwork is finished now. This nice Brazilian rosewood fingerboard looks pretty cool. So anyway, get this off the neck jig and back on the body. We still got our shielding to do and some electronics work to do, but we're heading down the pike here. I still have to touch up this area here in front of the nut. So let's get moving. Well, we have our shielding finished. You see here where we did the copper shielding around the sides and all that. And then in the floor we put the original plates back in. They are original and they are vintage, so they're going back. So that helps that out a little bit. We've added some more height foam here for the pickups. Looking at the pickups and the pick guard, we ran a few different ground wires. We ran a ground wire from here to here and from here to here. We've grounded the pickups to the pots instead of to the shielding. And we cleaned that up a little bit. We've also shielded the covers. You see a little bit of the copper peeping out here. We're ready to stick this back together. Well, okay. Finally. Just short of 11 hours on this guitar. Man, this was ugly. Anyway, so we have a new, slightly larger frets, refret, level fingerboard and all that. Plays great. We have a new bone nut. I've tightened up his tuning keys, cleaned up the headstock and neck. Then we get down here. We had some wiring problems. The front pickup was intermittent, so I had to fix that. There's actually a lead coming off the pickup was broken. Actually, the end of the winding was intermittent on it. Had to clean up and tighten up his toggle switch. Clean and tighten the controls. And of course, add the ground bus that I mentioned earlier. Then we come up here. I had to remount the roller pots here so they weren't locked up underneath the pick guard. Had to clean the switch there and reconnect the grounding for it so that worked. Set his bridge height and intonation and all that. Of course, pickup heights, everything on this guitar was completely set up. Then for the last final insult, when I was finishing the guitar up, I could not get the tremolo to balance. Sometimes with these old Fenders, the vintage ones, they were actually probably designed to use larger strings on, so when you use lighter strings nowadays, you can't get enough string tension to balance a tremolo properly. So I had to take it apart and shorten the spring up on it a little bit. But at this point, everything operates properly. It's in good shape. So he has a 66 vintage Fender Jazzmaster that actually everything works and it can play. So I'm going to give him a call and let him know that it's finished. Hopefully he'll be happy with this. So until next time, play nice.